Welcome to Echoes of Ihsan, the podcast where we dive deep into the traditions and practices of Islam.
I'm so excited to be here.
And today, we're taking on a topic that you, our listeners, have been asking for a while now: Islamic burial practices.
It's a fascinating area full of rich details and deep meaning.
And to really get into it, we're turning to a foundational text in the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence, the Muwatta Imam Malik.
Ah, a classic.
Specifically Book 16, which is dedicated to the topic of burials.
I love that we're going to this source. The Muwatta Imam Malik, it's not just a dry legal text, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a window into how the early Muslims actually lived and practiced their faith.
It gives us that lived experience.
Exactly. And in Book 16, we get to see how they approach death and all the rituals and customs surrounding it.
And I'm telling you, I am so intrigued to get into those details, like, what were the specific garments used to shroud the Prophet Muhammad? What were the debates around walking in front of or behind the bier? And what about all the different perspectives on the soul's journey after death?
Oh, all those little details. They're like golden nuggets, aren't they? They bring the whole picture to life.
They really do.
Yeah.
So let's start right at the beginning with the washing of the deceased, or what's known as ghusl.
Ghusl, yes. It's such a beautiful act of purification and preparation for the final journey.
It is.
And the Muwatta Imam Malik, it lays out this process with such care. It emphasizes handling the deceased with the utmost respect.
It's like every step is imbued with meaning.
Exactly. So the body should be washed a minimum of 3 times, and they would use water mixed with camphor and lotus leaves.
Camphor and lotus leaves.
Yeah. These ingredients, they were known for their cleansing and aromatic properties, so it wasn't just about physical cleanliness, you see.
No, it was about something more.
It was about honoring the sanctity of the body, even in death. And the Muwatta, it doesn't stop at just the basic steps. It gives us glimpses into how these practices were applied in real-life situations.
I love those real-life examples. Do you have any that come to mind?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most touching is the account of Atiyah. She describes how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he gave detailed instructions for washing his own daughter after she passed away.
Oh, wow.
And then he even offered his own waist wrapper to be used for her shroud. It's just a gesture of such tenderness and humility.
Such a powerful image.
It really is. It reminds us that even in the face of death, there's still room for love and compassion.
That's so true. But what about all those practical things that come up? Life doesn't just stop, even when someone passes away.
You're absolutely right. And the Muwatta Imam Malik, it addresses these practical concerns.
It does.
Yeah, like there's this instance where Asma bin Umays, a companion of the Prophet, she asked about performing ghusl after washing a deceased person while she was fasting on a cold day.
Oh, wow. So imagine that.
Right. It shows that they grappled with these real-life challenges.
So what was the ruling in that case?
She was told that it wasn't necessary to perform ghusl again in that situation. They recognized the need for flexibility.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and they prioritized the well-being of the living without compromising the principles of purity.
It's a really balanced approach.
And then there's another example that really shows this commitment to practicality: tayammum. If for some reason there aren't same-gender washers available for ghusl.
So what do they do then?
The Muwatta says they can perform tayammum, which is purification using clean earth.
Oh, I see.
It's so symbolic, like adapting and being resourceful to ensure that the deceased is honored.
Really beautiful.
It is. And after ghusl, the next step is shrouding the deceased, known as kafan.
Okay, so tell me about kafan.
Well, kafan is all about symbolism, too. The Muwatta describes how the Prophet Muhammad was shrouded in 3 simple white garments made of cotton.
Just simple white cotton.
Yeah, and that simplicity, it reflects this core Islamic value of humility and equality in death.
We're all equal before God in the end.
Exactly. But here's the thing. While the Prophet's shroud was simple, there were other times when individuals expressed different preferences.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, there's this really powerful story about Abu Bakr, the Prophet's closest companion. As he was nearing his own death, he requested to be shrouded in a garment that was stained with red clay.
Stained with red clay.
That's interesting.
I know, right? But his reasoning was so profound.
What was it?
He said, "The living have greater need of the new than the dead."
Wow.
He was putting the needs of the living above his own, even in his final moments.
That's incredible.
It really is a testament to his selflessness.
Yeah.
And then there's Abdullah ibn Amir ibn Alas, another companion of the Prophet.
Okay.
He said that if there was only one garment available, then they should use that no matter the condition.
So again, practicality and humility.
Yeah.
Exactly. And these stories, they show us that while there are guidelines, there's also room for individual circumstances and interpretations.
It's not about being rigid. It's about the principles behind the practice.
I couldn't agree more. And this nuanced approach, it really shines through when we look at funeral processions.
Funeral processions, yeah.
Yeah.
They're so powerful, such a visible expression of grief and support.
They are, but I've always wondered about how people are supposed to walk in relation to the bier, the structure that carries the deceased.
Yeah, is there a certain way you're supposed to do it?
Well, that's where things get interesting. Because even in something as seemingly straightforward as walking in a funeral procession, there were different interpretations in the early Muslim community.
Really?
Yes, the Muwatta tells us that the Prophet Muhammad, as well as Abu Bakr, Umar, and Abdullah ibn Umar, they all walked in front of the bier during processions.
So that seems like the way to do it then.
You might think so, but then the Muwatta also mentions that Umar himself led the procession from the front during the funeral of Zainab bint Jahsh, a very prominent woman in the early Muslim community.
Oh, so even he did it differently sometime.
Exactly. And then there's Shaman Urwa, a respected scholar, who preferred to walk ahead of the procession but would pause at the al-Baqi cemetery until it passed.
So there wasn't one right way.
It seems that way. The emphasis was on reverence for the deceased and supporting the bereaved, no matter the exact positioning.
It's beautiful how the Muwatta captures this diversity of practice.
It is. It reminds us that even within a shared tradition, there's room for different understandings.
That's a valuable lesson for today, especially as we navigate all this diversity around us.
Absolutely. But before we move on, let's talk about some of the specific customs and prohibitions surrounding funeral processions.
Okay, like what?
Well, one notable prohibition was against following the bier with a burning torch.
A burning torch.
Yeah.
Why was that?
While the Muwatta doesn't explicitly say, it likely had to do with wanting to move away from pre-Islamic customs.
I see. Create their own distinct ritual.
Exactly. Plus, fire in such a solemn setting, it might have been seen as inappropriate or even dangerous.
Yeah, that makes sense. So they were defining their own way of honoring the dead.
You were. And this brings us to another important practice, the takbir.
Allahu Akbar.
Yes, Allahu Akbar. God is greater. It's such a powerful declaration of faith, especially in the face of death.
It helps us remember what's truly important.
It does. And the Muwatta gives us examples of the Prophet Muhammad performing the takbir at funerals.
Does it?
Yeah, like when An-Najashi, the Christian king of Abyssinia, passed away, the Prophet announced his death to the community and led them in prayer, performing the takbir 4 times.
Wow, the Christian king.
I know. It shows a prophet's respect for humanity, regardless of religious boundaries.
That's so powerful.
It is. And there's another moving account where the prophet prayed over a deceased woman at night. She was described as poor and maybe overlooked in life. Oh, that's sad.
It is, but the prophet, he chose to honor her in death, showing his care for everyone, especially the marginalized.
These stories are so inspiring. They give us examples to follow to be more compassionate and inclusive ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they remind us that every life has value and deserves dignity, no matter who they were in life.
So well said. This has been incredibly insightful. We've gone from the purification of the body to the etiquette of processions and the meaning of the takbir.
It's been a great start to our deep dive.
It has, but I think it's time for a little break. When we come back, we'll delve into the prayers for the dead and explore the Muwatta's account of the Prophet Muhammad's burial itself. So stay tuned.
And we're back, continuing our journey into Islamic burial practices through the Muwatta Imam Malik.
It's been a fascinating exploration so far.
It has.
And before we get to the Prophet Muhammad's burial, I'd love to learn more about the prayer for the dead, the Salat al-Janazah.
Oh, yes, such a powerful prayer.
I've seen it at funerals, and it's so moving. But I have to admit, I don't know all the specifics. Well, the Muwatta Imam Malik, it actually gives a really detailed account of the prayer as described by Abu Huraira.
Oh, one of the Prophet's closest companions.
Exactly. So after the opening takbir, the prayer starts with praise and blessings for the Prophet Muhammad.
Makes sense. Honoring him at the beginning.
Right. And then it moves into a supplication to Allah on behalf of the deceased.
Acknowledging their relationship with God.
Yes. Recognizing them as a servant of Allah, born from his creation, and emphasizing that we all return to him.
It's a beautiful reminder of where we come from and where we're going.
And then the prayer talks about the deceased's actions in life, but in a really nuanced way.
Oh, how so?
Well, it highlights their belief in Allah and his messenger, acknowledging their faith,
Yay.
And then it asks Allah to multiply their good deeds if they were righteous and to overlook their wrongdoings if they erred.
So it recognizes that we're all human, capable of both good and bad.
Exactly. It's about God's mercy and
It
forgiveness.
must bring a lot of comfort to the mourners.
It does. And it's not just about the deceased. The prayer also asks for strength and steadfastness for the living.
Yeah, because grief can be so overwhelming.
It can. So it asks Allah not to test the mourners beyond their capacity and to grant them patience.
So the prayer addresses both the deceased and the living.
It does. And what's fascinating is to see how this prayer was understood and applied in different ways by the early Muslims.
Oh, do you have any examples?
Yeah, there's this one where Sayyid ibn al-Musayyab, he saw Abu Huraira praying specifically for a child's protection from the torment of the grave.
That's so touching.
It is. It shows this deep concern for the well-being of the deceased, even beyond this life.
Yeah, the belief that death isn't the end.
And then there's Abdullah ibn Umar, another companion of the Prophet.
Okay.
He chose not to recite during the prayer.
Oh, that's interesting. Any reason given for that?
The Muwatta doesn't say, but it shows that there was diversity even within this ritual.
So different ways of expressing reverence.
Exactly.
Mhm.
The Muwatta also talks about the appropriate times for the prayer.
Oh, are there specific times?
Yeah, it says it's permissible to pray after Fajr, the dawn prayer, and after Asr, the afternoon prayer.
But only after those obligatory prayers are done.
Right. And I wonder if those times were chosen because they represent moments of transition, you know?
The start of a new day and then the shift from day to night.
Yeah, it's like weaving life and death into the fabric of prayer.
It's beautiful.
It is. And while the Muwatta provides these guidelines, it also acknowledges that there are times when flexibility is needed.
We saw that with shrouding, too.
Right. So there's this account of Aisha, the Prophet's wife.
Right.
She asked for the body of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, a prominent companion, to be brought to the mosque so she could pray for him.
To mosque.
Yeah. The Muwatta doesn't say why, but maybe she felt it would be more impactful there, you know, in that sacred space.
Yeah, I can see that.
But some people disagreed with her.
They did.
Yeah, they might have thought it wasn't the usual practice. But Aisha, she defended her decision. She said the Prophet had done something similar. He prayed over Suhail ibn Beda in the mosque.
So she had a precedent.
Exactly. And it shows that even Aisha, someone known for upholding tradition, recognized that flexibility was sometimes needed.
It's all about context.
And intention. And this reminds me of our discussion about walking in front of or behind the bier.
Right, different interpretations.
So the takeaway is that while there are established practices, there's room for individual interpretation as long as the core principles are maintained.
Respect, humility, sincerity.
Exactly. So now, are you ready to delve into the Prophet Muhammad's burial?
I am. Let's hear it.
Okay, so the Muwatta gives a detailed account of this event, which is so important for Muslims.
It must be.
It says the Prophet passed away on a Monday and was buried the next day, on Tuesday.
So a prompt burial.
Yes, showing respect for the deceased.
And people came to pray over him.
Yes, individually. There was no designated leader for the prayer, which really emphasizes how unique the situation was.
It was a loss for the whole community.
It was. But then there was the question of where to bury him.
Ah, right. That's important.
Some people suggested burying him near the mimbar in the mosque.
The mimbar, the pulpit.
Yes. It would have been a way to honor his role as a leader.
Keeping him close to the heart of worship.
Exactly. Others suggested burying him in al-Baqi Cemetery, where many of his companions were buried.
So both options had deep meaning.
They did. But Abu Bakr, he remembered a hadith where the Prophet had said that prophets are buried where they die.
So that settled it.
It did. The Prophet was buried in Aisha's house where he passed away.
In her house.
Yes. And the Muwatta even describes how the grave was prepared.
Oh, does it mention the niche?
It does. You know, in Medina at that time, there were two ways to dig graves. Some had a niche on the side for the body and some didn't.
Interesting. So which way was the prophet's grave dug?
The gravedigger who usually made niches arrived first, so he prepared the Prophet's grave that way.
Those little details bring it all to life.
They do. And of course, there was a lot of grief and sorrow surrounding the Prophet's burial.
Of course. Do we see that in the Muwatta?
Yes. Salama, one of the Prophet's wives, she said that she didn't fully grasp what was happening until she heard the pickaxes digging the grave.
The sound of those pickaxes, a harsh reality.
And Aisha, she had a dream before the Prophet died where she saw 3 moons falling into her room.
3 moons.
And Abu Bakr interpreted it as a sign that the Prophet would be buried in her house.
Wow, like a premonition.
Yeah. But even with those signs, the grief must have been overwhelming.
Absolutely. So the Muwatta focuses on the prophet's burial, but it also talks about other burial practices at the time.
Right, like transporting the deceased to Medina for
Oh,
burial.
to be buried near the prophet,
Exactly. It was seen as a great honor.
like a final pilgrimage.
It's beautiful. The Muwatta mentions Sadi ibn Abi Waqqas and ibn Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufail, both important figures who died in Al-Aqib but were carried to Medina.
To be laid to rest near the prophet.
Yes. But it's interesting, not everyone felt the same way about being buried in Medina.
Really?
Yeah, like Hisham ibn Urwa, he preferred to be buried elsewhere.
Why was that?
He was worried that because al-Baqi was getting crowded, his bones might be disturbed if someone more important needed to be buried nearby.
So practical concerns also played a role.
They did. It shows that even with this deep reverence for the prophet, individual choices were still respected.
So much to consider.
There is. This has been such a rich discussion.
It really has. We've learned so much about purification, the prayer for the dead, the prophet's burial, and even burial locations.
And there's still more to explore.
That's right. When we come back for our final segment, we'll delve into the Muwatta's insights on visiting graves, the etiquette involved, and the Islamic perspective on dealing with grief and loss. Welcome back to our deep dive into Islamic burial practices through the lens of the Muwatta Imam Malik.
We've covered so much ground already.
I know, right? From the rituals of purification to the Prophet Muhammad's burial, it's been fascinating.
Absolutely. But there's still so much more to uncover in the Muwatta Imam Malik.
Well, let's get to it then. What's next on our journey?
Let's talk about visiting graves.
Ziyarat al-Qubur.
Exactly. It's a practice that connects us to those who have passed away.
It can be such an emotional experience, you know?
It is. And as with everything else, the Muwatta Imam Malik offers guidance on the etiquette surrounding these visits.
So what does it say? How are we supposed to approach visiting graves?
Well, as always, the Prophet Muhammad's example is paramount.
Right, of course.
The Muwatta tells us that he would stand when a funeral procession passed by.
A sign of respect.
Exactly. And once the procession had passed, he would sit down.
It's like a balance, you know, honoring the deceased, but also acknowledging the continuity of life.
It is. And the Muwatta, it even addresses some of those less conventional practices.
Oh, you mean like those stories about Ali and Abi Talib?
Yes. Ali, he was known to rest his head on graves and even lie on them.
That sounds a little strange to me.
I know, it might seem disrespectful at first. But Malik, the compiler of the Muwatta Imam Malik, he clarifies that sitting on graves was only forbidden if you were doing it to, well, relieve yourself.
Oh, so it's about intention.
Exactly. The action itself isn't inherently wrong, it's the context that matters.
That's a good reminder for us all.
It is. The Muwatta also describes other customs, like Abu Umama ibn Sal ibn Hunayf. He would wait for permission before sitting down after a funeral.
Oh, wow. That's so thoughtful.
Isn't it? It shows such sensitivity to the mourners.
Absolutely. These details, they really give us a glimpse into the heart of the early Muslim community.
They do. Their respect, their compassion, it all shines through.
So we've talked about the etiquette, but what of the emotional side of things? Does the Muwatta Imam Malik offer any guidance on dealing with grief and loss?
It does, and it starts by acknowledging that grief is a natural response to loss.
Of course, it's human nature.
Right. But the Muwatta, it does prohibit excessive weeping and wailing.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, there's this story where Jabir ibn Atik, a companion of the Prophet, he tried to silence some women who were crying loudly at a deathbed.
Oh, I can imagine that didn't go over well.
Yeah, but the Prophet Muhammad intervened.
As you say.
He told Jabir to let them cry, saying that when the necessary time came, they shouldn't cry.
And that necessary time meant after the person had passed away.
Exactly. So there's a time for expressing grief, but it should be done with restraint, especially when someone is dying.
So as not to disturb them.
Right. And maybe also to avoid being seen as challenging God's will.
So it's about finding that balance again.
Finding that balance between expressing our emotions and accepting God's decree.
And this idea of acceptance, it's really highlighted in the Prophet's teachings on martyrdom.
Ah, yes. He expanded the concept of martyrdom beyond those killed in battle.
He did.
Yeah, he listed 7 other types of death that were considered martyrdom.
Like what?
Death from plague, drowning, pleurisy, stomach ailments, fire, a collapsing building, and childbirth.
Wow. So many.
It was a way of offering comfort to those who had lost loved ones in these ways.
Their deaths weren't meaningless.
Right. They were still seen as achieving a special status in the eyes of God.
It's a beautiful way of reframing tragedy.
And then there's the idea of contentment, or rida. in the face of misfortune, especially the loss of children.
Losing a child, that's unimaginable.
It is. And the Muwatta shares this hadith where the Prophet says that no Muslim who has 3 children die will be touched by the fire except to fulfill God's oath.
So, a promise of paradise for those who endure such loss.
It's a powerful message of hope and reassurance.
But what about those who lose fewer than 3?
Well, a woman asked the Prophet that very question about losing 2 children.
And what did he say?
He said, or 2.
So the same promise applies.
Yes. It shows that any degree of such loss is worthy of God's mercy.
It's so comforting to know that.
It is. And there's another hadith that talks about how a believer is constantly tested with misfortunes until they meet Allah with no wrong actions.
So suffering is a form of purification.
It can be seen that way. And the Prophet, he also emphasized that we're not alone in our suffering.
He did.
Yeah, he said, let the misfortune that befalls me be a comfort to the Muslims in their misfortunes.
Wow, such empathy.
He understood what it meant to suffer.
And there's that hadith about seeking God's reward in times of distress, right?
Yes, we belong to Allah, and to Him we are returning. O Allah, reward me in my misfortune and give me better than it afterwards.
It's a powerful reminder to turn to God in our darkest moments.
He is always there for us. So the Muwatta Imam Malik, it guides us on how to deal with grief, but it also explores the Islamic understanding of the soul and the afterlife.
We've touched on that a bit already.
Right, like the image of the soul of the believer as a bird residing in the trees of paradise.
Such a peaceful image.
And then there's the hadith, where Allah Himself expresses a longing to meet those who long to meet Him.
That's so beautiful.
It emphasizes that our relationship with God is a two-way street.
We yearn for Him, and He yearns for us.
But of course, there are also fears and anxieties surrounding death.
Right, like the story of the man who asked to be burned and scattered because he was so afraid of God's punishment.
Such a powerful story.
It is. But God, in His mercy, forgave him.
It reminds us that God's mercy is always available to those who sincerely repent.
And then there's fitra, the innate purity with which every child is born.
Like a newborn camel, perfect and without blemish.
A reminder that we all start with a pure heart.
Exactly. And while the Muwatta doesn't get into heavy theological debates, it does acknowledge the complexities of human nature.
We have free will, but God also has a plan.
And there's that haunting hadith about people passing by graves and wishing they were in the deceased's place.
I've always found that one a bit unsettling.
It is, but makes us think about our own relationship with death.
How our experiences in this life shape our view of what comes next.
And finally, there's the hadith that describes death as both a relief for the believer and a relief for others from a wrongdoer.
A reminder that death is a natural part of life.
It brings closure and new beginnings. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Muwatta Imam Malik's teachings on burial practices, I'm struck by how much wisdom and guidance it offers.
It's been a truly enriching experience.
It has, from the practical details of rituals to the profound reflections on grief and the afterlife. The Muwatta Imam Malik provides a compassionate and insightful framework for navigating these complex and deeply personal aspects of life and death.
And it's all presented with this incredible balance, acknowledging the sorrow while also offering hope.
It reminds us that while traditions may vary, the fundamental questions surrounding death are universal.
We all grapple with loss, seek meaning, and yearn for something beyond this world.
So as we conclude this episode, I encourage you, our listeners, to reflect on what has resonated with you.
What insights will you carry with you? And how might these teachings inform your own understanding of life and death?
Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration.
May it inspire you to continue seeking knowledge and understanding both within and beyond the Islamic tradition.